When we talk about performance, the measure that we typically refer to is earnings. However, there are going to be some circumstances where raw earnings is not seen as being particularly relevant. For example, if you have a shareholder, they're probably going to be more concerned with earnings per share. And calculating an earnings per share number is going to be relatively straightforward when there are only ordinary shares on issue and where the number of shares on issue is unchanged or unchanging. This is not always going to be the case. And it's for this reason that we have an accounting standard, IAS 33, which dictates how we calculate earnings per share numbers. In Australia, this is replicated as AASB 133. Earnings per share is a fundamentally straightforward concept. You simply take an earnings number, you divide it by a shares number, and that gives you an earnings per share number. However, this ignores some of the detail that's required. Which earnings number do you use? What number of shares do you use? And the answers to this aren't always going to be straightforward. So when we look at this now, we're going to see that it comes up with two distinct concepts of earnings per share. It talks about a basic earnings per share, which might be described more as a here and now number, and you have a diluted earnings per share number, which might be considered a more futuristic earnings per share number. So how do you go about calculating these numbers? Well, a basic earnings per share is pretty simply calculated as dividing the profit or loss attributable to ordinary shareholders and divided by the weighted average number of shares on issue. Which earnings number? Well, it's the earnings number from continuing operations, and it's only the earnings which are attributable to the shareholders in the parent entity. In terms of the number of shares on issue that you divide it by, it's the weighted average number of shares on issue during the period, and there are going to be adjusting events. So for example, if you have a share split which doubles the number of shares on issue, that shouldn't be seen as halving the number of earnings per share, so you need to adjust the weighted average number of shares to reflect that. So share splits, bonus issues, they're adjusting events. The diluted earnings per share number is a lot more problematic. Why? Because it recognises that the number of shares on issue might change for things that have already been done. For example, the firm might have options on issue, or it might have convertible securities on issues. That's going to change, quite obviously, the shares number, but it's also potentially going to impact the earnings number as well, the numerator. So obviously when you calculated a diluted earnings per share number, you need to adjust the number of shares on issue, the denominator, to reflect the number of shares that might be issued, and you would need to adjust the earnings number, the numerator, in a consistent manner to ensure consistency. So for example, if you have convertible securities which are paying interest now, if you're going to add the shares being issued from those securities being issued, you need to adjust that in the number of shares. But to the extent that when the convertible securities get converted, the interest is no longer payable, you're also going to have to adjust that into the earnings number, the numerator as well. That's to ensure that we have consistency. So the diluted earnings per share number is calculated by dividing the diluted earnings per share of the entity, that's the adjusted number, by the adjusted number of weighted average shares on issue. This is to reflect the impact of dilutative securities. So please note there's an earnings adjustment and a number of shares adjustment. You need to be consistent in this process. The disclosure requirements are pretty obvious. You have to disclose the numerators numbers that are used, the earnings numbers, and you need to disclose the number of shares issued, the denominator numbers, and you need to disclose the impact of dilutative securities. Pretty straightforward if you're going to be able to use a earnings per share number sensibly. Thank you.